Good evening, everybody. Today is Wednesday, November 9th. We are continuing our survey of the Old Testament story. This week we will, I promise you, get to the end of the Old Testament, and we'll reserve next week is our last in this series, and we'll be doing the New Testament story in that one session. As I've said before, it's taken a long time to do this Old Testament story because it literally unfolds over the course of 1500, 200, 2000, maybe 3000 years, as opposed to the Christian scripture that is contained in about 100 years. So it's like apples and oranges to try to talk about one story or one being more important or something like that. So before we get started, Terry had something that our friend Carla sent her. Carla is one of the stalwart members of the Wired Word group that meets on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. But let me see, here it is. And Carla wanted us to share this with the Bible study folks. She says, the first computer date Apple with limited memory, just 1 byte. Then everything crashed. Pretty good, good summary. I suppose we could have said that, and that's the whole Old Testament story. But anyway, that is fun to have that shared with us. So, any questions about where we are? My recollection of where we are in the story is the Israelites have moved into and are occupying the land that had been promised to their ancestors, to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants. And that's where we'll start tonight, but I want to see if anyone has any questions or loose ends remaining from earlier.
So one of the things that, and it just popped into my head as you were talking about the differences between the time frames of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It seems like a lot of the Old Testament to me is stories of people who are nomads. I mean, because they're always moving.
That is the case until this this really important change in their lives when they actually occupy that land. Remember, we had talked about Abraham and his immediate descendants, that tribe that was growing. They essentially leased the land from the Canaanite owners. They never owned it. They were sojourners, is the Old Testament. It's an English translation of the term that's used in the Hebrew in the Old Testament to talk about them as they were borrowing the land from the real owners.
Right.
And remember that one exception is the grave. Abraham bought the cave for a grave for Sarah. And that's the only land that the patriarchs and matriarchs, those generations, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the only land that they ever legally owned was that burial cave in Machpelah, it was called.
Okay, yeah,
Where we are in the story is the Israelites having gone down into slavery in Egypt. I mean, they didn't go down there to be slaves. They went down there as welcome guests because Joseph had just saved Egypt,
mm-hmm,
and they were welcomed as honored guests. But then over the course of several generations and a new regime and a new dynasty in Egypt, they were essentially enslaved.
right,
And then we have the Passover story and the Exodus, and Moses, at the command of God, leads the children of Israel, who are essentially slaves, leads them out of Egypt toward the promised land. On the way, they stop in Sinai. That stop happens to take 40 years, but they are in Sinai, and in that time, they receive God's teachings.
mm-hmm,
That they bring with them as they as they move toward that land, the land of Canaan, that had been promised to their ancestors. As a matter of fact, that literally in the they had a trunk, a trunk that had long sticks for carrying it, and in that trunk they carried the stones that God had given them, that had basically the 10 Commandments on them. So the law written
right,
by God, that was in this, they called it a tabernacle. Also in there was Moses's staff that he had used to, when he raised it, the Red Sea parted and the Israelites went across. When he lowered it, the Egyptian army was flooded. That staff was in this ark, and there was also a bowl of manna that never got moldy or wore out, or whatever you say for food. It was miraculously always fresh. The story, and we glossed over it, but the number of stories in the wilderness of God caring for the Israelites, and the Israelites constantly complaining about the conditions. They very early on, they say to Moses, "Why did you bring us out into this desert? We had it way better when we were slaves in Egypt. And now we're going to starve." And God starts raining what they called manna, and it's sustenance for all the people. And it was every morning, enough came down for everybody to have just the right amount. If you took more than your share, it all rotted. It was just wonderful stories. What's that teaching us during this time in the wilderness?
yeah,
All kinds of things, like God does provide, and trust in God, and you don't have to hoard and try to steal from your neighbor to pad your own table. It is sufficient so that all can have enough. No one can have too much, and no one has too little. There's just, again, a wonderful series of stories kind of like that in the in the many chapters in the book of Exodus that deal with this trip through the wilderness, receiving the teachings, and then heading toward the promised land. So as they approach, now if you happen to have a Bible in front of you and it has maps in the back, that would be that might be helpful for you in just kind of to keep track of where Israel is geographically and politically. That very much is part of this, the rest of the Israelite story. But if you can look on a map, Terry, I don't know if there's a resource that works for you, so I'll try to describe as much as I can what I'm talking about. If you look in your map and you identify, especially if you've got a map that's identified as Old Testament, and you identify where Canaan is, or where Israel and Judah, depends on what era you're looking at on the map. But even if you think of a modern map of where Israel is today, it is literally on the crossroads of three major civilizations. One was the succession of civilizations that came from what's today Turkey, what back then was called Asia Minor, and Greece and Italy. So those countries, or those regions up there, over to the east of Israel or Palestine or Canaan, over to the east is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. That's considered kind of the cradle of Western civilization. The first writing that we know of comes from that, from the people in that area, but they develop a number of different empires over the years, and we have to trace some of these because they at various times impact Israel quite a bit. And then to the bottom is, of course, Egypt. And Egypt is a major power, and it is these three powers, one to the north, one to the east, and one to the south of Israel, that are always vying for influence and control of that crossroads of the Mediterranean. That's the land that the Israelites understood that God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. So as we begin where we for today, the Israelites, now led by Joshua, who's Moses's successor, Joshua leads them on a series of military campaigns to take various cities, take over various cities, defeat the native kings and inhabitants, and establish Israelite dominion and essentially sovereignty over this land. And they're as the stories are told in Samuel, I mean, in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so on, as the stories are told, God is directing directing Joshua just the way he used to talk to Moses. He's directly talking to Joshua and saying, go conquer that people right there. And go, and God is a very military strategist, you would say, as it's presented in this part of the Old Testament. There's also another parallel thread that you also see stories of, in which the Israelites are becoming part of the existing civilizations and beginning to dominate them rather than conquering them. So it's insinuation into existing power structures and becoming the powerful in those areas. Now, it doesn't have to be that it was by military conquest or by kind of assimilating into and then dominating the current population or the former population. It probably was some combination of that, and in their national memory, they memorialize both of those kind of approaches. The bottom line is that by around the year, now this is very, very roughly, but around the year 1250 BC, the Israelites are the dominant people in what's now what had been called Canaan, what's now called Israel and Palestine. What would have at that time just been called the land of the Israelites. It wasn't a nation. It was a land that the Israelites, made up of 12 different tribes, not all of whom liked each other, 12 different tribes that were all somehow identified as Israelites, and they took possession of different parts of the land that they had taken over. During this time, the various tribes, the 12 tribes, there was nothing that unified them, except when one of the surrounding kingdoms would attack. Tribes would reach out, they'd call to other tribes and say, would you come help us? And then they'd go help us, they'd defeat the enemy, and then they'd kind of go their separate ways again. And that went on for a couple of 100 years. And then the Israelites, looking all around them, and one thing they saw that everybody else had that they didn't have was a king. And they asked Samuel, who was basically the chief priest and spokesperson for God. He was kind of a successor to Joshua. They asked Samuel to pray to God and ask God to give them a king. And Samuel said, that's a really lousy idea. God said, tell them that's a really lousy idea. That if you have a king, you're going to become dominated by your king. And that's not how Israelites were used to living. Well, they insisted on a king. God gave them a king. King Saul, nothing particular. He was a military guy. He had gotten some fame in fighting some of the conquest wars, and so he was the first king. For a while, he was a pretty good king, and then it's very plain from this, even from the distance of 3,000 years since this would have been written down, it's clear that he had significant mental illness and went off the deep end and became extremely paranoid, and with some justification, because people had decided, yeah, it was wrong for us to get a king. We should get rid of the king. And one of the king's soldiers was a guy named David. And David, people started rallying around David and saying, we'd really like David to be, we think he'd be a better king than Saul. And David essentially went along with that. Now, there's a wonderful backstory to that, where David understood himself to be called by God for this very purpose. But kind of the palace intrigue of what was going on was that David, who was supposedly a bodyguard even to Saul, was working to undermine Saul. And eventually there's basically a civil war between people loyal to David and people loyal to Saul, and David wins. And David gets all 12 tribes, something Saul had not done. David gets all 12 tribes to agree that he's king. He's king of all of them. And they agree to that. David goes on to, now that he's quelled the problems in Israel, he goes on to conquer other additional land for Israel, including he conquers a holdout city called Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not previously part of the Israelite empire or whatever. But David conquers Jerusalem, decides to make it his capital. He builds a gorgeous palace for himself in Jerusalem, tries to make Jerusalem kind of a showcase city, and spends the end of his career having enforced a peace all around him. Nobody's going to come up against King David. It just so happens that all three of those major empire areas, at that very point in history, none of the three of them was strong. And so this little kingdom has a moment in the sun where for about 80 years, Israel is the big guy in the neighborhood. David establishes this capital city, and people come to see David, the warrior king, who's so wise and blah, 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 blah. And one of the important stories in that cycle, and again, there are many, many wonderful stories about David, and David is not a goody two-shoes. I think probably most of you know the story of David's his adultery with one of his generals, the wife of one of his generals. And toward the end of his career, when he's conquered every, David says to God, look, I have this magnificent palace here in Jerusalem, and you are still, we're the only shrine we have to you is this tent over this trunk with these relics in them. And David says, I want to build you a temple worthy of your glory. And I think just wonderfully interesting twist, God says, no, not you. You have too much blood on your hands. You're not the right guy to build the temple. And the story goes on. The family intrigue in David's family is just thick and wonderful and scandalous and page turner. But toward the end of his reign, he chooses his then oldest son, who incidentally is the son of David and that woman that David had adultery with. It's not the first child they have together dies at birth. And it's basically this is one of those things that doesn't work with our mentality, but the baby's life is sacrificed as basically an appeasement for the sin of David. The baby pays the price. Later, that same woman, who is a widow, thanks to David, that same woman becomes one of David's wives, and in fact, his favorite wife. And their next child is the one that we know as Solomon, who becomes David's successor. At the end of David's reign, for about 20 years, it's kind of like a Prince of Wales. Except that he actually gives power to his son, and they are co-kings, David and Solomon, together until David dies, and then Solomon goes on to become famous for his riches, his wisdom, and that he is allowed by God to build a temple to God, a temple for God. And that's what he does. And kind of his biggest claim to fame is what's called Solomon's Temple. And it was by all reports, absolutely magnificent. Gold and teak and again, this was when the kingdom of David, or what was known as Israel, was at its prime. It had commercial outposts all over. So it was really at its economic and political prime. Solomon reigns a long time, and basically from the viewpoint of the Old Testament story, he kind of outlives his usefulness. He starts he starts taking wives from all over the world, and then kind of incorporating their religions and their traditions into his piety. And kind of, while this magnificent construction is going on for the temple for Yahweh, he's dabbling in all the other religions of all his other wives. I've shared with some of you that my last trip to the Holy Land, one of the places that we went to was an outpost of King Solomon's, and it was basically a country castle, and it had 3 wings. It had the wing for the king, the wing for the horses, and the wing for the wives. And the wing for the horses and the wing for the wives were about the same, not set up, but about the same size. And it was just, that's how Solomon did it. By the end of his reign, Israel is in a turmoil over a successor to him. And in fact, what happens is, as soon as Solomon dies, the various tribes of Israel, there's a civil war between them, and they go to war against each other and end up splitting into 2 different countries, 2 different kingdoms. And the 10 northern tribes take the name Israel with them. The 2 southern tribes take the name Judah with them. The largest of those tribes is the tribe of Judah. The other one in there is the tribe of Benjamin, and Benjamin is the tiniest of the tribes. So it's really Judah and little tiny Benjamin. But Judah has Jerusalem. So the people in Israel create a new capital, and it moves around from time to time, but it's primarily in the city of Samaria. So for a couple of hundred years, there are 2 Jewish or Hebrew or Israelite, however you want to name them, countries. They go to war against each other from time to time. They have little to do with no cooperation between them. At one point, those 10 northern tribes, what's called Israel, they decide that their best security strategy was to invite the Assyrians, the people to the east, coming from what's today Iraq, from Mesopotamia, to invite them to be kind of guardians of Israel's security. And so they say, yeah, you guys just, you be our benevolent overlords, okay? And the Assyrians say, yeah, that sounds good to us. And it's less and less benevolent all the time. And eventually the Syrians come in and wipe them out. And the kind of the war strategy at the time was to was to scatter people as far from their homelands as possible. And when you hear reference maybe to the 10 lost tribes of Israel, or some reference like that, that's basically what happened. The people of Israel from those 10 tribes ceased to have a place in the world. They must have gone somewhere, but we don't know where. Just a little aside, as I understand Mormon theology, at least some of those Israelites made it to what's now called South America or Central America, and took their Israelite identity there with them, which then sets up that Jesus, after he came to Palestine in the Christian story, he then went to South America to announce the good news to the people there, who were also the children of Israel. Again, I know quite a bit about Mormonism, but I'm not an expert. But that's my understanding of kind of one of the little twists to this story. So the Northern Kingdom has ceased to exist. The Southern Kingdom is in great peril. They're not very strong. That's those same Assyrians who destroyed their cousins to the north. They're threatening Israel, Judah, threatening Judah, and while the Assyrian army is poised to come after Judah, a new army from Babylon comes up from behind and takes the Assyrians and conquers the Assyrians, and then goes on to conquer the Judah. And in the case, and this is what's called the Babylonian exile. This is the Babylonian Empire conquered Judah. They didn't take out all the people like the Assyrians had done up north. The Babylonian, they had a different kind of military strategy. They just took the elite from Judea, from Judah. They took the priestly classes, the royal family, the princes. They took the highfalutin people, scraped them, and took them to Babylon. And in many cases, used their talents that they brought with them to undergird the Babylonian Empire. And they made use of, in other words, stories of Daniel, for instance. Daniel is a trusted assistant in the administration of the Babylonian Empire until he gets busted by people who are jealous and ends up in the lion's den. Again, another wonderful story that's kind of typical of the cycle of stories of what's going on in Israel's history. After the elite of Israel have been in Babylon for approximately 70 years, the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great, I think, is the Persian emperor at the time. The Persian Empire decides to let the Jews, now they're called Jews, to let the Jews return to Israel or to Judea, which is where they get the name Jew, return to Judea and rebuild. And they even subsidize it. They send workers, they send money along with the elite going back to Jerusalem and Judea to rebuild. Persia wants a little, a puppet state there. They want to rebuild it and, of course, control it. They're not going to say, we're going to rebuild it and we'll go our way, you'll go your way. They'll say, we'll rebuild it and you'll go our way. And as long as the Persians were paying the bills, the transport and everything, the logistics, the Israelite leadership went along with that. They tried to do a major re-rallying of the Israelite people around the teachings of Moses. And it's really striking, the stories about when the elite come back from Babylon and they've adopted some new ideas. They've brought some new ideas into Israelite culture and understanding. And that's kind of at the forefront of this attempt to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. Now they do rebuild the temple, but again, by all the reviews of the time, this second temple was a dud. It didn't have the gold, it didn't have the cedars from Lebanon, it didn't have the huge cherubim and seraphim. The description of Solomon's temple is just awesome in the exact use of that word, awesome. This new temple was not, and that functions now for several hundred years. Everybody kind of recognizes it's not what it used to be, but then they also say, we're not what we used to be. We used to be the kingdom that David ruled, David and Solomon. That's who we were. That's who we aspire to be again. That's where these messianic tendencies come into the end of the Old Testament. It is this hope, this expectation that God is not done with us yet, that there's still God still has something in mind for us, and that a descendant of David will come and make all things better. that's where the storyline of the Old Testament, it kind of peters out, because then there's a couple of centuries between the end of the Old Testament and the New Testament where we just don't have anything. It's like the lights were out. But during that time, it's not that nothing has happened to that land. During that time, the Persians have been defeated by the Greeks, Alexander the Great. He brings along with him the great Greek Hellenistic Empire that rules for 300 years or so, only to be overthrown or defeated by the upstart Romans, the kind of backwater Romans who conquer the much more sophisticated Greeks. And it's pretty much at that point that the New Testament begins. The Romans have only been in charge for less than 100 years. I mean, that's, in terms of civilizations, that's nothing. I think Julius Caesar may have, or Pompey, one of the generals, I think took Jerusalem in maybe 40 or 50 years before the birth of Jesus. So we're really at that time that the Jesus story begins. We're at a time of great international ferment. The Greek civilization is still kind of dominant, although it is run by the Romans now. But the Romans are always looking to the Greeks and the Greek civilization, Greek art, Greek military, always looking, Greek theology. So much of the Roman myths are just Greek myths with Roman names substituting for the Greek names. They absorb the Greek Empire, the golden age of Greece. They absorb that, and eventually, when they become a pretty well-established empire, they then build on that and develop a uniquely Roman oratory and statuary and culture. But it's very much built on the classical Greek culture. It's, again, right in that mix that the Jesus story takes place. The Romans are in charge. Greek is still the dominant language for international commerce, for legal documents, those kinds of things. And Greek philosophical ideas have buried themselves pretty deeply into the culture of the lands that the Greeks conquered. So the idea, for instance, of the immortality of the soul is lifted from Greek philosophy and theology. It's not there in the Old Testament. There is some hinting about resurrection of the dead, but there's nothing about the immortality of the soul. That's imported into emerging Christianity from Greece. Let's stop there and see if you got questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Mike.
You said there was a 1,000 or 2,000 year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament.
No. If I said 1,000, I misspoke. It was about 200
Oh, about 200.
years.
Okay, maybe I misinterpreted it.
Yeah, no.
But even so, at that time, lifespan was 30 or 40 years, right? So a lot of generations, a lot could have happened in that time period, but there's no documentation of any of that. So what you're saying?
There's a group of books called the Apocrypha that
Oh, you've mentioned
some people include in what they call the intertestamental, and it's Lutherans and most Protestants have chosen not to consider those scripture.
Okay.
And I don't have all of the the whys and wherefores of why we made that decision. I think at least some of it is scholars are able to say it purports to be from this time, kind of eyewitnesses account from this time, but the language clearly shows that it was written way later.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so kind of the credibility of the witness is in question. Other questions?
Yeah, I just want to double check that the 12 tribes, those are like sprung from the 12 sons of Jacob.
Yes, it's the 12 sons of Jacob, except that Joseph doesn't have a tribe named after him, but his two sons each have a half tribe named after them. So altogether,
Okay.
it still comes to 12.
So the ones that died, because he had like a couple that died, did they have their offspring made tribes in their name? Is that what they did?
Which ones are you talking about who died?
Didn't like one named Simeon or something die? I can't remember. Or I can't remember. But I know that
there is likely, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but there is likely in the vast number of stories of that clan, that scandal that I was talking about is rampant in that clan. So it is certainly possible that Simeon at some point is killed in the story. But my working assumption would be that was after he had 6 wives and 20 children
God,
to carry on his name.
that makes sense. Because I know that I saw that when they wanted to take Benjamin back to Joseph before they knew he was Joseph, and Jacob says something like, I already lost Simeon or whatever his name is, and now you want to take Benjamin too, or something like that. So I knew that.
I think that reference is Jacob says, I've already lost Joseph.
Oh, right.
And now he wants to take Benjamin also.
Right, you're right.
That I can't tolerate.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay.
But it is the 12 sons of Jacob, also named Israel.
Also named Israel after he fought with the guy.
Right. And it's those 12, except that, as I said, Joseph doesn't have a tribe of his own. Joseph's 2 sons have a half tribe for each of them.
That makes sense.
So together there are 12 tribes.
Got it.
And I don't know the details of how they figured out what a half tribe was or any of that. It's undoubtedly in the book of Leviticus, because the book of Leviticus is just packed with formulas and rules and regulations for everything. And so how to divide up the land and so on is probably in there.
Now Jesus sends through the tribe of, or whatever, of Judah, right? Or the house of.
Correct.
Judah.
Right.
Okay, got it.
Other questions? All right, your assignment for next week is to read the New Testament.
All of it?
Yes. It's only 100 years long or something. No, I'm only kidding. We're going to talk through the storyline of the Old Testament. We're going to start 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus, because that's where the storyline begins. I'm just leaving you out there, leaving that hanging out there for a week. All right. See you all next week.